Semi-hydro completely changed how I grow plants, but honestly, I nearly gave up in the beginning because nobody tells you about all the little weird things that you need to be paying attention to. Let's dive into it. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So yes, as I was saying, semi-hydro has been a game changer, and a lot of people that do try it, the ones that stick with it, do find it very, very useful, either for their entire collections or for certain types of plants. A lot of you have always made those comments to me. It's just like, yes, this might not work in regular soil, but actually I've moved it into semi-hydro and we are all good. So starting off, in this video, I'm going to show you a bit more about some of those weird things that happen when you're first transitioning plants into semi-hydro that might mean that you're going to lose a whole bunch of roots before you've even got anything going with that plant. Also, why flushing matters more than people ever realize, and why transitioning the wrong plant at the wrong time will almost invariably end in failure. But first things first, semi-hydro is not like growing in soil, but just with extra water. One more time, it's not like growing in soil with just extra water. I know it might sound simple, but it does require to be said. You need to start thinking about things differently to what you might have done if you're growing in soil. You need to think about oxygenation. So how much oxygen is reaching those roots? What is the water movement within that growing root area, basically? So if you've got a reservoir of water and maybe there's a lot of algae in it and they're not getting any water going up towards the plant, so it's not being able to filter up, that is a problem. So you need to think about that water movement as well. Sometimes just filling up the reservoir and not actually watering the plant the same way that you would something in soil is going to cause you problems. Those roots that are higher up within that growing media are going to need to get wet as well, and sometimes it takes way too long for that water to kind of move up from the base, from that water reservoir into those higher roots through capillary action. And if your plant is really, really dry, that extra time might mean the difference between success and failure. How are the nutrients being delivered to the plant? And that's one of the things that people don't always talk about. You can't just use a bog standard fertilizer with semi-hydro. A lot of the times there are reasons why there are certain fertilizers that are basically designed to work within soil media and other ones that are designed to work within semi-hydro. There are a lot of houseplanty fertilizers out there, and we've come a long way in the last few years where a lot of the soil fertilizers also work in semi-hydro. The ratios might be different, so try to go for something like that so you don't have 1,000 different bottles of fertilizer. These are for my semi-hydro, these are for my soil, these are for... Keep it simple. Keep it simple if you can. And then you need to think about things like root adaptation. And I know a lot of people will touch on this, especially if you're first starting off, on how you adapt the roots that were used to growing in soil to now start growing in semi-hydro, or do those roots even matter? The soil roots I'm talking about now, especially if you're transitioning into semi-hydro. And one of the lesser discussed points when it comes to semi-hydro is that transitioning, the time of the year that you transition, is almost as important as how you transition. So the time that you are transitioning and the type of plant as well is going to be highly important. So I'll give you an extreme example. I have got, and I'm trying to remember the name of the plant. I'll put it up here and I'll see if I can find a picture. It is now in its dormant season. That's why I'm using this as an extreme example. If I was going to use this plant and it looks a bit, the base looks like a swollen onion and it's got the curly leaves. If I was to do what everybody will blindly do and just go, I'm going to transition this in the summer. It's spring and summer. This is where we always transition plants. This is where they're going to do their best. Not for that plant. That plant's active growth season is autumn and winter in the UK for me. So Spring and summer is when it's fully dormant. I'll see if I can find a picture of what it looks like now at the beginning of spring. And this would have freaked me out a year and a half ago when I first got this plant and didn't know much about it. I have since learned. This is its normal state of being, i.e. dormancy, in the spring and summer. It don't look great in the spring and summer. Come winter and autumn, where a lot of other things will slow down, this picks up. So guess where the best time for that plant would be to transition it into semi-hydro? Autumn, not spring. So you see that there's a difference there as well. So an example of any other plant that's more traditional in the sense that it will pick up during spring and summer, guess what I'm going to say? If you're going to be transitioning something out of soil and moving it into semi-hydro, do it in spring. And important distinction that a lot of people don't always mention because it's always like they lump in spring and summer. There is a difference between transitioning a plant too early in the season. So I'll give you an example. The first week of March, depending on where you live, if you're living in the northern hemisphere in the colder, grayer bits, beginning of March, you might as well be transitioning it in the middle of winter. So for us, and I'm including myself in this because the UK is one of those nations, I wouldn't be transitioning it. I would be in the spring if it's got spring and summer growth season, but maybe I might wait until kind of mid towards late April. See the difference there? If I was living in Greece, where March already starts being super kind of springtime and the weather is a lot better, yes, I might transition it very early in the spring season. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is the summer, because people are just like, yeah, transition it spring or summer. There's a difference between you transitioning a plant at the beginning of June. It's got the whole summer to bounce back, have ideal conditions if that is its growing season, than you transitioning a plant on the last week of August. Because guess what you've done there? You've put in a whole bunch of stress on that plant at the point where its kind of growing season is pretty much almost at its very, very end. It's when it's going to start not being an active growth season there. So there is a difference there. Be strategic if you can with when you are transitioning your plants. Make sure you also know when the active season is for that plant. Don't just assume that everything, remember the example I gave you before, is going to be actively growing in the spring and summer. The next thing that I want to touch on this little section is about stress plant. Guess what? And I know this is something that a lot of us will do. This plant is stressed. There's all these things going on with it. I am going to add it to semi-hydro as a last attempt to see if I can save it. Semi-hydro isn't a cure-all. It's also not instant. It takes a while for that plant to get established in semi-hydro. So if you've put a plant in semi-hydro when it's already stressed, the only thing you've achieved is to stress it out more. And depending on how long it's been stressed for, that plant might not make it, because that's the last little straw on a stress pillar there. It's just like, no, I'm out. And then you'll be sitting there going, oh, I did semi-hydro wrong, or semi-hydro is difficult. Be smart with your transitions. And then the other big thing that people will talk about, and I have done this several times over, but I know the risk that I'm taking with, and I have had my fair share of failures as much as successes. Look at any of my unboxings when I've imported plants from Ecuagenera. A lot of the times, my default, especially if they're an anthurium, is straight into semi-hydro. No transitional period or nothing like that. A lot of those plants are not grown by the international growers in semi-hydro. They are grown in a soil type media. So you are putting, or I am putting, a lot of stress on those plants. And as I said, equal amount of successes to equal amounts of failure. I have lost a lot of plants there that I'm, in hindsight, looking back going, these ones did okay. They went straight into semi-hydro. They did great. These ones died. So, but I know that going in, and I am willing to take that risk. If you are not willing to take that risk, just remember that you're going to need to transition them gently. And ultimately, this is also the reason why a lot of people will transition plants straight from when they start growing. And by that, I mean, you've taken a cutting, You're growing it in damp sphagnum moss or damp perlite or in water, not in a soil type media, and then you transition it straight into semi-hydro, by and large, most of the time, again, depending on the plant and how tolerable it is to that, it will be fine. So you can see the difference there. Another big one is root rot in semi-hydro doesn't always look like the root rot that you would used to be seeing when you're growing in soil. Yeah, it doesn't always look the same. Because with semi-hydro, you've got other things that you need to be considering. Are the roots suffocating? Are they submerged for too long and they are suffocating? They have not kind of moved into water roots yet and they are suffocating. Is that water reservoir stagnant? Has it been stagnant for a long time? Are you, I want honest answers down below if you've been growing in semi-hydro. Are you clearing out, literally taking the reservoir if you can, and this is the risk sometimes when you cannot remove a reservoir from a growing apparatus, are you removing that reservoir every 3 to 4 months at a minimum, I would say, taking it to the sink and giving it a cool, clean, like you would if you were washing dishes? Are you? Because if that water is stagnating for a long time there's a lot of things that are probably growing in that water reservoir that you do not want growing anywhere near your roots, yeah? The other thing is mineral buildup. We were talking about fertilizers a moment ago. If you are using fertilizers and you're fertilizing weekly, so very weak fertilizer solution very often or every time you water, are you remembering every few months to flush your media? Because guess what? A lot of the semi-hydro media, whether it's LECA, whether it's PON, whether it's whatever it is that you're growing semi-hydro as a material, minerals will build up. So if you keep doing that for months or years on end without doing any flushes, and I've lost my fair share of plants on this, I will put my hands up and say, yes, I've messed up as well. Flush your media, get some of that mineral buildup up, and that could just look like you running water through for the next like couple of waterings or 3 waterings, flushing it all the way through, making sure you're clearing that reservoir for whatever is there because things are building up within the reservoir as well. All of these things will help. Then you need to think about things like, is that root rot looking like weak roots or roots that are rejecting because of the transitional period? There's a lot of people that talk about soil roots versus semi-hydro roots or water roots. These are things that people that have been growing for a while learn, but when you're first starting off, nobody tells you about this. You might potentially lose some, if not all, of the roots of that plant. Hopefully, if you are losing all of the roots of that plant, by that point you should have started getting some roots that are adapted to semi-hydro. So remember what we were talking about before? Sometimes just moving a plant into semi-hydro and expecting it to just go and just immediately get better and faster and really stable isn't realistic. It's going to need to transition. That could look like something fast, or it could look like something that takes weeks, if not months. Again, think about what I was talking about before, where things are moving from a stressed condition into a new environment. So, you've got a stressed plant, and it's going to take it 3 months to transition properly into semi-hydro. Guess what you've done? Yep. More stress on top of other stresses. So just be smart with both your transitions and how you're looking and how you're experiencing what root rot might look like, or the beginnings of root rot might look like in semi-hydro. And the other little tiny bit that I'm going to add onto this as well is the size of the growing material that you're using for semi-hydro matters a lot more than you would think. So small LECA balls, small, like the traditional kind of size of PON, works great. If your roots are small, thin, or medium sized. If you've got anything that has got chunky roots, big LECA balls or big Lechuza style PON will help you a lot. Those are big roots. If you put them in a tiny, really compacted, because when you're putting it in, especially if it doesn't have that many roots, and if you've ever lifted something that is in semi-hydro, especially things that are in something as heavy as LECA can be, because essentially it's little baby rocks that are in a pot, and you've got thick roots. So imagine tiny little spaces, and a lot of weight coming in from all of that material, and you've got thick, like Monstera roots. Guess what that root is going to have to do in order to grow within that media? It's going to have to squeeze. It doesn't have enough kind of strength to push all of that material up that is weighing it down. So bigger, chunkier materials will make a big difference depending on the size of the roots of that plant. Small roots, and I'm talking about final root size, because a lot of people will start going, oh, the roots are quite small. Are they small now because you've got a very juvenile plant and eventually they will become behemoths? Or are they always going to stay as small as they are? That also is important. People will always also underestimate the quality of the water and how important it is to semi-hydro. It is one of your big parameters when you are growing in semi-hydro. The key is in the word, it's semi-hydro, hydro being the water. So you need to know how hard your water is. The harder your water is, the more dissolved particles are within that water. Yes, remember what we were talking about before about the fertilizer and the mineral buildup? Your water will also be contributing to the mineral buildup within your growing media. So you need to know the water hardness of your water. How many times can I say water in one sentence? Then mineral buildup, again, fertilizer, things like that. You need to know how much of that is building up within the water that you're giving to the plants. Also, on the point of fertilizer as well, not all of them, but especially fertilizers that are meant for semi-hydro or fertilizers that work for both houseplants and in semi-hydro. And if they don't have it on the packaging or on their website, feel free to reach out to the manufacturer. They hopefully will respond to you. See if their fertilizer, because some of them are, and they don't always tell you this, especially if you're buying fertilizers that are meant for other things that grow in grow tents. There is an assumption that you're using this fertilizer with reverse osmosis water or rainwater. Make sure that the ones that you're using, if you're just using straight up tap water and not using distilled water or reverse osmosis water or even rainwater, that the fertilizer is okay with dealing with that. And you're not just adding minerals on top of minerals. Because sometimes if something, rainwater, reverse osmosis water, has very little dissolved minerals within it already, because it's about as pure as you can get, there's going to be a higher mineral concentration in this in order to be available to the plant. However, if this has got a higher mineral concentration and you're putting it into something that's very hard in terms of water, you can see that it's not the same thing. Coming back to the flushing frequency as well, because if you're getting salt buildup, how frequently are you flushing? And also, do you have the capability maybe, if you are flushing, to flush? Because I know that not everybody will have reverse osmosis water, not everybody wants to or has the willingness really to do distilled water or can get rainwater. Can you potentially do your flushes with something like reverse osmosis water, distilled water, or even rainwater? Even if it's just really infrequent, if it's once every 3 months, every 4 months, can you afford to do that? Do you have the willingness to do that? Do you have the capability to do that infrequently, to just help during that flushing season to just kind of take out most of those mineral buildups, because there's nothing already in those kind of water types, essentially. There's not an awful lot of minerals already within those water types. So at least in my humblest opinion, they're a bit better at flushing out salts within growing media, especially if you're doing a proper deep flush. The other thing you need to remember when it comes to water is residue within the tank. What's the sludge looking like? Because let's be real, if you haven't cleaned that water reservoir, it's going to start looking like sludge at some point. Is any algae growing in the water reservoir itself, but also within the pot? That is something you need to bear in mind there, because how algae is reacting with both the roots and the growing media is going to have an effect on how the plants are going to be performing. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, and I know a lot of us are talking about it. Clear pots have been an absolute game changer, specifically when it comes to growing in semi-hydro. Yes, there are risks, and I was just talking about algae now. This is a risk for algae, because if you've only got this, and you've got it in a really bright condition, and you've got a water reservoir in the terms of it just sits in a water reservoir here, what you're probably going to get is algae growing within this pot because it's getting the light that it needs, and algae growing within the water reservoir. So there is a point where you're just like, okay, I need to be able to see the roots need to get some oxygen. This is a traditional kind of pot that I've just kind of burned soldering iron, burned some holes in it to get more airflow. But there is a point where this needs to get into a covered pot, into a cache pot, so that you don't get the algae buildup. It doesn't stop it entirely depending on where you are growing the plant and depending on your conditions. I will say this until I'm blue in the face, but it will reduce the pressures of it. If you've just got an unadulterated naked pot sitting in the sun, at some point very soon, you will get some algae buildup on there. However, that is one of the negatives. The positives is, see how easy it is for me to look inside and see the roots. So I can monitor how the roots are doing really, really easily. Much easier than if this was opaque, obviously. I can also look at moisture tracking within this, because when you're first starting off, everybody's just like, well, when do I water? I don't know, because this is dry, but this is wet. Start monitoring the water. Is the bottom layer still wet and is the other entirely dry? Or is it that weird in between and you're also getting some condensation that you can see on the pot? Maybe at that point, wait a bit before you water again. These are things, unfortunately, you're going to have to experience yourself. So this is the biggest question I always get. It's just like, when do I water? And that was my question when I was first starting. And I hated the same answer that I'm going to give you now because that's what everybody gave me. You're going to have to learn on your own as to when you, with your plants, in your conditions, are going to need to water, because it's not as cut and dry, sorry for the pun, as it would be with soil media. There's going to be different tolerances depending on the plant and depending on your space and depending on the care that you are giving it with that media. So I would say if you're starting with semi-hydro, don't start with your favorite 1 or 2 plants and then you see them perish because you can't adjust for that early enough. Start with something that you are happy to experiment with. Clear pots are also great when you're first starting off because they can show you really visually how the transition is going. Are some of those roots, the old roots, dying off? Are there new roots coming in? That's equally important in this scenario. So they're really good for observation. And obviously seeing any problems before they happen and reacting to it accordingly. Now, an extra little tip for you on here as well. Net pots. Net pots. These are ones that I found on Amazon. They're clear orchid pots. They're not marketed as net pots, technically. You can get more traditional net pots, which look a bit like this. These are meant for ponds. These are meant for orchids. However, these are both quite good. The slight risk with these ones, because the holes are so big, is you might get an awful lot of the roots coming out of here. And I will tell you this to save you some grief later on. If you need to up pot it, it becomes exponentially more difficult when you've got half the roots hanging out of this, because it doesn't matter how gingerly you try to remove this and up pot it, later on you will lose a considerable amount of those roots. These pots, the more orchid ones, which have got smaller slits, depending on the plant, again, if you've got very fine roots, this isn't going to solve the problem. But if you've got thicker root plants, they generally won't go through these holes, or they won't, not as many. You might get one root coming out, a little tiny bit of a root, and you're happy to sacrifice that whilst bringing the plant out of this pot to up pot it. But these are really, really good, especially if you know that a plant is very, very specific about it needing both a lot of air, but also a lot of moisture. I'm looking at anthuriums here. Big, 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 big win on this one. I'll start wrapping up with something that might be a bit controversial. I found that semi-hydro starts working really well the moment that you stop fussing with it. One more time. The moment you stop fussing with it is the moment that it starts doing well. And the reason why I say this, and come with me on a little journey. When I was first starting, I was talking to a lot of people that had immediate success with this, immediate success. And I'm just like, how are they doing really well versus what I'm doing? Guess what a lot of those people that had immediate success were before they moved into semi-hydro? Underwaterers. Yes, yes. Guess what I wasn't? An underwaterer. Guess what a lot of people are not? Underwaterers. And then they decided to move to this because the overwaterers, we fuss. We fuss even more with like soil media because you kind of have to. This will make you move to more of an uncomfortable place because stop fussing. Just let it do its thing. It will potentially look busted for a while before it looks better. That's the one thing you need to remember. And the best advice I can give you is have something around to distract you so you're not focusing on the fussing of that plant. So it can do its thing, and be aware that maybe don't give it primo like location in your space, especially if you're one of those people that's very visually orientated. You don't want to look at busted plants because it probably is going to look a bit busted whilst it's kind of like transitions and settles. That's fine, but maybe don't put it somewhere you can see it all the time because that will just remind you, and your urge will be to fuss. So try to minimize over monitoring. That's basically a very long-winded way of me saying that. Make sure that you're not moving things around too much. We talked about the stress of transitioning a plant into semi-hydro. If you adding onto that every like other day, moving into a different location because you decide, I think it's struggling. Like if I move it to here, it'll be fine. If I move it to here, it'll be fine. Leave it alone. Leave it alone. And then if you are like me and you're just like, what's happening with the roots? What's happening with the roots? Without negotiation. If you know that you are going to be the person that's just like, what's happening with the roots, happening with this? This is not an option anymore. This is a must. Clear pot or net pot, so you can see the damn roots without having to do anything like that. As long as you're not obsessing. And then there is the point with semi-hydro of over-correcting. It's very easy for you, again, this is the over-fussing, to just kind of go, well, if I move this plant here, or if I do this, and if I adjust this, and if I do this, and if... I'll give you a little kind of side story, tangent, story time, whatever you want to call it, basically. So, in the world that I work in, my day-to-day work tends to be in digital marketing. I tend to work a lot with social media adverts, Google adverts for my clients. I had a client that came to me from another agency and they were just like, it was working really well. What has happened? I can have a look. I told them, I'm like I'll have a look and see, maybe I can spot what was changed and everything was doing well, and then what change happened after that, that everything went to shit. Yeah, I'm assuming they were using some form of software. I would hazard a guess there. And I'm not using the word AI because this software has been around in my industry way before AI was a thing. We just never called it AI, basically. So they were using some software that does automatic changes blindly without kind of any kind of overarching strategy behind it. So I looked at that account and I saw 600 changes in a month. Guess what I can't do then? I cannot pinpoint what, if anything, caused it to do well. And I also cannot pick up what, if anything, made it go bad. So the point of this story that's unrelated entirely with plants, can you imagine if you're just getting a plant and you're fussing with it so much and you make 600 changes in a month and it starts improving? How are you going to know what made it improve? What of those 600 things, or combination of 2 or 3 things, did it? Because 600 changes, or if something goes well and then it goes wrong, how are you going to... I know this is I'm dragging this very extreme example, but you can see what I mean. Stop fussing it. And if you're going to make changes, 1 or 2 in a month, and let it run its course. You need to see what is working and what isn't working before you start compounding and start spiraling, basically. Into some of my final thoughts. The thing that you need to remember is that transitions can be a bit rough. They can take a long time. You need to remember to make your life easy. Clear pots, net pots. Don't overfuss the plants. check for things like algae, make sure that you're flushing on a frequent basis, make sure you understand your water, understand your fertilizer, understand your plant and when you are transitioning it and what to expect from there. But it can take a long time. It can be a bumpy road. It can be a road with failures. But ultimately, in my opinion, semi-hydro is a wonderful thing. The moment that you start understanding that the leaves have got nothing to do with the semi-hydro, the roots are doing all of the heavy lifting. So you need to be addressing the roots at that point. And ultimately, the moment that you stop treating every yellow leaf as an emergency, as long as the roots and establishing, as long as everything else is going well, is the moment that things start working well. So essentially, in a nutshell, stop fussing. Stop fussing. Move away and move on to something else. Move on to something that you've already got in soil. Fuss that, it's fine. It generally tends to be more forgiving. It expects it. Semi-hydro is, you kind of need to let it find its feet, basically. But yes, tell me what you think. Have I missed anything that you've experienced? Did any of this surprise you? Have you got any tips for when people are first starting off and some of the mistakes that you made as well and what you've learned from them and how you would do things differently knowing what you know now? Let us all know down below. I know there's a lot of people that are still very, very keen to either try or get better at semi-hydro, so I know they will love all of the comments down below. But yes, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.